Welcome back to Asian Art. In this lecture, we're going to look at this new culture that emerges in the Edo period, one that appeals to the everyday and tries to find a new voice for what's happening in this sort of exploding culture of the urban life around the cities. Here's one of the earliest examples that we have of this new style that emerges in the Edo period called ukiyo-e, which literally translates as images of the floating world. And this floating world was a world of pleasure, it was a world of relaxation and hanging out with highly educated women who were courtesans and prostitutes and whole entertainers and musicians. As you see here, a group of women and their male friends are chatting it up. And this is a casual gathering. This is just something people did. And we're sort of looking in on this scene, much like we did way back in the Heian era, when we were sort of looking down on what was happening in the upper court of the Yamato clan in the Heian era. But this is now commoners. These are the sort of devil-may-care playboys and exciting people who have a little extra cash and are having a good time in the city. This is a really folding screen originally, so we would have seen this sort of as a series of groupings of figures relaxing, and we're sort of peeking in on a scene that we should not really be looking at because people are acting a little more casual than they would in a more formal setting. Now, if you look to the right of the picture, we see a very interesting character. Here, this young man is leaning on a samurai sword and he's dangling from his hand a fan. He's in this sort of odd posture, but he seems to have sort of taking some infatuation with these ladies, one of whom has a pet dog. She's sort of one of the characteristics of the courtesans of this sort of licensed quarter, the place where the prostitutes hung out. And this was the floating world. This is the place of assignation, or people just kind of let their fantasies happen. In a city that was very structured, in a city that was very planned out, this is the one area where people were, so to say, able to let their hair down. This young man here, he is a Ronin samurai. He's basically an out-of-work guy who has a bit of pocket change, a deadly weapon, and a little bit of charm. And he's here to kind of talk up the ladies. These men were sort of not upstanding citizens. In fact, they were often referred to as twisted. And that's what the word kabuki means here. It means twisted. You can see by his slouchy posture, leaning on his samurai sword, that he is indeed quite twisted. And it's these characters who were the subject of this early ukiyo-e, these playboys of the Edo period. Here is a map I've showed you before of the city of Edo. As you know, there was sort of this domain of the nobility, a domain of the commoners. And then in the river, and then later further north, there was a place called the Yoshiwara. This was this place, this sort of meeting place where people could go to kind of escape their roles and strictures. The Yoshiwara literally was a reclaimed swamp. It was a floating on marshlands. And so, but in this place, it was also a place of fantasy and abandon. Before Yoshiwara was built, entertainments would happen in the late fall when the river dried up, and people would set up temporary stages, and there performances would happen where people could mix and mingle. And the actors who performed here were known as the riverbed beggars. They did these seasonal performances. They were short skits, dramatic actions. They were often meant to appeal to a whole wide range of classes of people, people who were sort of lower nobility, or upper merchant class who had some pocket money, and they would come to see what would be, odds and ends and tricks. You see a performer here doing a dog trick. He's wearing an odd costume as the dog jumps through the hoop. He's actually dressed up like a Portuguese because it's exotic, it's weird, it's different, it's unknown. And here we can see in all their colorful clothing, the kimonos that everyone is wearing, he really does quite stand out. Another interesting character on this temporary stage is this otter. I want to call attention to the way this otter is dressed, sort of looking like he's holding a fan in his mouth. And if you could see carefully, he's got a samurai sword on his hand. This is actually an otter dressed up in a wild costume of the Ronin samurai, the kabuki. And this is sort of making fun of the kabuki who are wandering around the city, causing trouble, getting into fights, and romancing the ladies. Imitating kabuki were one of the hallmarks of this riverbed shows, and it wasn't until Izumo no Okuni took to the stage in Kyoto in 1603 where she performed her version of imitating a kabuki. She dressed up like a man, this Ronin samurai in an outrageous outfit, and sort of copied the mannerisms and customs of the Ronin. She had a boyfriend who had been a Ronin samurai, Nagoya Sanza, and he had learned some no theater, and so she learned how to do the no theater dance. Izumo no Okuni was spectacularly popular. She was and drew these enormous crowds. And soon everyone wanted to imitate what Izumo Okuni was doing. And lots of women took the stage and performed in these new women's kabuki, Yujo kabuki. You see this is quite a spectacular number here, represented with a large chorus of women all dressed in the same costumes, and the lead performer with her shamisen sitting on a chair with a tiger skin. This would have been quite a spectacle at this time, all these women showing off their dances to a largely male audience. This got a lot of trouble. Men were fighting over the women, riots broke out, and eventually the government, which was always looking for ways to assert its control over the populace, banned women from the theater in 1629. And women did not return to Japanese theater until 1900. This was not the end of kabuki, though. At the same time that women had been performing on stage, also young men were performing like women, performing like men. So these young boys were dressed up in these sort of sexy outfits, and they would come out, as you see here, all dressed in unison and do their dances. Wakashu kabuki, as it was called, was similarly dealing with prostitution and creating trouble in the audiences, and it too was banned in 1652. And at this point, there was no kabuki, and it looked like kabuki would never be again, except the theater producers, who had been making a fair amount of money, went to the government and begged them. They said, "You can't ban all theater. People want to see this, and these out-of-work actors, they're just going to get into trouble if you don't give them a job." And so the government told them, they dictated the terms of how they would allow kabuki to return. And this was called Yaro kabuki. It was adult kabuki. It had to tell an actual story. It just couldn't be a skit about a guy picking up on a girl. It actually had to tell a single story. And it had to only be performed by adult men who had their forelocks shaved to prove that they were indeed adult men. And here we see this early Yaro kabuki, this adult male kabuki. The government thought for sure this would be something that would absolutely kill this kabuki all on its own. Who would want to see adult men dressed up as women? But in fact, it carried on, and kabuki became a mainstay of the Japanese stage all the way into the present day. With extraordinary artistry and skill, they revived kabuki into this spectacular and wonderful theater form. Here is an early advertisement for a kabuki, Yaro kabuki production. It is a woodblock print that has been hand painted in 1702. Now you'll see here, we'll talk more about woodblock prints a little bit later. You'll see here that there's a male character holding the umbrella, and then there's a female character with a very clearly red cap on. The red cap was a silk handkerchief that it was laid over the forehead of the male person playing the female role. And this was sort of a convention in early kabuki, allowing men to play women's roles without actually having their foreheads shaved. So let's talk about the different types of characters you can find in kabuki. Essentially, there are two types, tachiyaku and onogata. Tachiyaku, which are the male role types, and onogata, which are the female role types. This basic distinction came about early on because for men to play women's roles, they required a very special kind of training, body type, and very exclusive kinds of clothing, which would be very expensive to procure. So men who played women's roles specialized in women's roles, and men who played men's roles played two different varieties, wagoto, soft male roles, and aragoto, bravura or bold or arrogant male roles. For early on, you had this sort of effeminate male role that was sort of based on what Izumo no Okuni did, this kind of transsexual playboy who was effeminate and at the same time loved to woo the ladies. So a lot of the early kabuki plays, such as Love Later from the Weissens Quarter, feature these kinds of heroes. These are typically noble characters who have fallen on hard times. They've been kicked out by their royal family members and are sort of hanging around the brothels in love, desperately in love with one or another of the courtesans that live there. The other male character we see is a sort of military type, became popular in the city of Edo, where there's a large military camp outside the city. This is Danjuro, Ichikawa Danjuro, the 12th generation of actors who began this character type. This is this big, giant character who has this huge, oversized costume and there's every bold kind of action and facial coloring to match. These kind of militaristic characters make these gigantic entrances with these swooping and powerful gestures. The aragoto by the Ichikawa Danjuro are celebrated in this incredible way. The family has continued on now, I believe, for 16 generations. The female role type is of a number of different varieties, but there are the male actors who perform them specialize in trying to capture as much as possible the sort of feminine charm and fashion of women of the Edo period. Here you see one of the most celebrated actors of the Onogata style, Bando Tomosaburo, who is now 70 years old. Here he is a much younger man, an absolutely incredible performer who captures with extraordinary strength and personality a whole variety of female character types. Let's talk about the evolution of the kabuki stage. When kabuki began around 1600, its stage was really identical to what you might expect to see on a no stage. The No theater from the earlier Kamakura period was really sort of the basis for the staging and acting that happened in the early kabuki theater. As kabuki gained popularity, its stage grew in size. You can see that the essential basic part of the main stage did not change, but this other side part, the hashigakari, this sort of entranceway, grew larger and larger. Now, it's interesting to note that the hashigakari is in the No theater only used for entrances and exits. And its expansion here I find really interesting because it's not the acting space that is growing, but it's the space that allows the performer to make a more flamboyant and stagey entrance. And this is something that has continued down to the present day, is the entrances of the performers is a key part of what makes these performances so special. Then, beginning in the early 18th century, the theaters began to move indoors. Permanent theater buildings were allowed to be built. And we start to see these very spectacular stages with this wholly new rampway that cut right through the audience. So the actors could enter from the back of the theater across in the middle of their audience onto the stage. These are called the hanamichi. And the hanamichi is sort of, which means here, the flower pathway. And the word flower is meant to imply gifts. And this is what the actor would do. They would walk down the middle of the audience, and the audience would shower them with gifts. They would throw them things as they entered this theater performance or as they exited. And so this kind of intimate relationship with the performer is something that has been, as I said, a hallmark of the kabuki stage. Here is some image evidence of Okuni's stage in 1603. You can see here on what looks to be a rather bare and simple stage with musicians, much like you would find in the No theater. And here is the kabuki theater in its full form in the Nakamura-za of 1859. This is quite a spectacular staging. And the man on the hanamichi now is that very same Ichikawa Danjuro playing the aragoto role type.